no.
Hey, who wants to hear a 51-year-old preschool television writer pretend he's hip with the kids in their gosh dang comic books? You do? Well, then Attack of the Mutant is the book for you. Our child protagonist this time around is Skipper, whose one joy in life is the collecting of comic books for profit. You know the type. Plastic and cardboard sleeve, never reading them in the misplaced hope that they'll appreciate and value. His best friend Wilson just doesn't understand. You should collect comic books, I told him. In about 20 years, these will be worth millions. I collect rubber stamps, he said, picking up a Z-Squad annual. He studied the sneaker ad on the back cover. Rubber stamps? Yeah, I have about 100 of them, he said. What can you do with rubber stamps? I asked. He dropped the comic book into the carton and stood up. Well, you can stamp things with them, he said, brushing off the knees of his jeans. I have different colored ink pads, or you can just look at them. He is definitely weird. However, the one comic book Skipper reads without fail is The Masked Mutant, a villain-centered periodical about an evil mastermind who can change his shape at will. The Masked Mutant is opposed by the League of Good Guys, led by the speed-based superhero the Galloping Gazelle. It's all very goofy and colorful, kind of a parody of the sillier bits of the comic book Silver Age, which is no surprise coming from Old Man Stine. A few modern comic titles do get name-dropped in this book, like Spawn, but I doubt Stine ever read them, or truly understood what the comic trends of 1994 even were. Because comics in the early 90s was all about being extreme, with 4 X's. Big muscle men with giant guns and samurai swords. Rob Liefeld. Sexy ladies with giant bazooka boobs and waists as thick as a pencil. Superman is dead. Frank Miller. Bane broke Batman's back. So many pouches. Yeah, Stine doesn't tap into that at all. A crankier writer may have made the book more about how comic books were better back in my day. The book doesn't go in that direction, but it's painfully obvious that Stine didn't know or didn't really understand what was going on in comics at the time. One day, Skipper has to go to the dentist to adjust his braces, so he hops on the city bus, where he meets a red-headed girl his age named Libby. They get to talking and discuss the origins of Skipper's name. When I was a little kid, I was always in a hurry, I told her, so I used to skip a lot. That's why they started calling me Skipper. Cute, she replied with a smirk. I don't think I like this girl, I told myself. Wow, we turned on her fast, didn't we? But hey, look, she likes comic books too. You collect comics? She sounded surprised. So do I. It was my turn to be surprised. Most of the comic book collectors I knew were boys. What kind do you collect? I asked. High School Harry and Beanhead, she replied. I collect all the digest-sized ones and some of the regular ones too. Yuck! I made a face. High School Harry and his pal Beanhead? Those comics stink. They do not, Libby insisted. Those are for babies, I muttered. They're not real comics. They're very well written, Libby replied, and they're funny. She stuck her tongue out at me. Maybe you just don't get them. Yeah, maybe, I said, rolling my eyes. Oh, fucking great. Exactly what I wanted to read after Comicsgate. A book about a boy getting hostile at a girl for not being a true comic book fan, trying to make her feel bad for enjoying the wrong things in the wrong way. Fucking fake geek girls, am I right? Skipper is the shittiest new Goosebumps protagonist we've had in a long while. A gatekeeping asshole who immediately distrusts women and pisses on any comic book that isn't superheroes. Any second now he's going to whine about forced diversity and Gail Simone. So Skipper gets off the bus, but on his way to the dentist he sees a strange, colorful building that stands out among the gray brickwork of downtown. What's really odd is that it looks exactly like the Masked Mutant's base. Skipper is both fascinated and weirded out by its presence, but he can't investigate it, dentist appointment and all. He talks it over with Wilson for a bit and theorizes that maybe the creator of the Masked Mutant comic saw the building and used it as inspiration for his villain's lair. It's a decent theory, but Skipper wants a closer look at it. A week later, he takes the bus back to the area, but the building is gone. It might have been torn down, but when he asks Libby, who lives nearby, she says she didn't see any construction going on, and it's a pretty clean site for a demolition. It's as if the building had completely vanished. A new issue of the Masked Mutant arrives that evening. Skipper reads it and discovers that in the fiction of the comic, the Masked Mutant had laid an invisibility curtain over his secret lair. That would explain how cleanly the real-life building disappeared, but, I mean, come on. The Masked Mutant isn't real, right? Well, Skipper has to check this out for himself, so he goes back to where the building once stood and brings Libby along with him. I guess they're friends now? Libby rolls her eyes at the idea of an invisible building, but they soon pass the threshold and Masked Mutant's lair becomes visible again. The two kids are weirded out, but the front door is unlocked, so they walk into the dark, empty lobby of the building. As he enters, a yellow light hits Skipper, scans him for some unknown reason. Besides that, there's no sign of anyone home. The place seems abandoned. They mess around with the elevators and end up in the basement, where they're soon separated. Skipper finds a room with a large printing press and updates his hypothesis that this is the place where the Masked Mutant comics are printed. Sure, a comics publisher who have also developed a cloaking device. That makes sense. But there's something very odd about the art being printed here. "This is impossible!" I cried out loud. I was staring at sketches of me. In every drawing, the boy had my round face, my dark hair, cut short on both sides and long on the top. He was short like me, and just a little bit chubby. He had my crooked smile, up a little higher on one side. He wore my clothes, baggy jeans and long-sleeved pocket t-shirts. The kid in the drawing even had a chip in his front tooth, just like me. Oh god, we've got a stalker of little boys here. Red alert, red alert. Before Skipper can really process any of this, Libby catches up with him, scared out of her mind, and insists they leave. Skipper begrudgingly agrees, and the two of them go home without hindrance. When Skipper gets home, he finds another issue of the Masked Mutant waiting for him. By the way, the turnaround for this comic is crazy. They do kind of hand-wave it away by saying that these last two issues have been special editions, but they've been released just days apart in a medium that does monthly releases. Anyway, this new issue shows the Masked Mutant having captured the Galloping Gazelle, and a comic version of Skipper sneaking into the lair to save them. It almost reads as a threat. "Come back, Skipper, or the superhero will die." Skipper doesn't know what's real anymore, so he decides to go back to the building the next day after school. Before that, though, he has a chat with Wilson. "I'm not collecting rubber stamps anymore," he said. "I gave it up. I couldn't hide my surprise." "Huh? How come?" "They took up too much of my time," he replied. Put a pin in this. We'll be coming back to it. So Skipper returns to the Masked Mutant's lair and makes his way to the upper levels. And wouldn't you know it, there's the Galloping Gazelle, in the flesh, tied to a chair. By the way, in both the TV show and the Attack of the Mutant video game, the Galloping Gazelle is played by Adam West. I only bring this up because if I don't, there'll be a dozen comments about it below. Skipper unties the gazelle, but the superhero doesn't seem to understand what's going on. He thinks that Skipper must be some kind of superhero, because average civilians don't save people. And he just won't accept it when Skipper says he has no superpowers. This becomes a problem when the gazelle starts dragging Skipper through the lair and past booby traps that would kill the average person. Thankfully, none of the booby traps are turned on. Finally, the gazelle and Skipper find the central room where the Masked Mutant waits for them. The Galloping Gazelle attempts to create a whirlwind to lift the Masked Mutant off the ground, but the Masked Mutant counters this by sticking his leg out and tripping the speedster up. Okay, I'll confess, this gave me a hearty chuckle. "I'm out of here," the gazelle cried, making tracks to the door. He turned back to me. "You're on your own, kid." "No, wait," I screamed. I don't think the gazelle heard me. He shoved open the door with one shoulder and vanished. With his only ally fleeing the scene, Skipper is forced to face the Masked Mutant alone. The mutant grabs Skipper and stretches his arms out to the ceiling, intending to drop the boy from a great height. Now, hold on to something. This is where it gets weird. I know. So before the Masked Mutant can kill Skipper, Libby storms in, seemingly unfazed by what she's seeing. She's holding what looks to be a toy gun, but claims it's a molecule melter. The Masked Mutant laughs at this, but Libby fires the gun, and the mutant dissolves. It was a real gun, and Libby shot the mutant with it, and the mutant died. There is a gun death in Goosebumps, and I don't know how to feel about it. But it's more complicated than that, as Libby begins to shift and change shape, revealing that Libby was the Masked Mutant in disguise this entire time. The Masked Mutant Skipper has been fighting this whole time was actually one of the mutant's henchmen, the Magnificent Molecule Man, who has the exact same powers as the Masked Mutant, I guess. And the Masked Mutant killed the Molecule Man for reasons? So the Masked Mutant posed as a young girl to scout out possible new foes. He chose Skipper after Skipper expressed knowledge of the Masked Mutant comic books. A reader, an outsider familiar with the mutant's world, might be just the challenge the Masked Mutant is craving. Oh, and remember that yellow light when Skipper first entered the building? Yeah, that was a device that turned Skipper into a comic book character. This doesn't seem to actually mean anything though. Like, instead of being made of flesh and blood, Skipper is now made of ink, but he still interacts with the world the same way, and he's still as mortal as before, and we never find out why that needed to happen in the first place. You know, even a throwaway line from the mutant, something like, "Oh, I can't touch real people, so I had to change you," that would have gone a long way. So the Masked Mutant is about to attack Skipper, but Skipper bluffs and says he's actually the colossal elastic boy, and his only weakness is sulfuric acid. So the Masked Mutant turns into sulfuric acid and drains out onto the floor. See, Skipper knew from the comics that if the Masked Mutant ever transformed into a liquid, he wouldn't be able to change back. You'd think the Masked Mutant would also have known this, but whatever, the villain is defeated, and Skipper is free to go home. He's feeling very upbeat. Woohoo! I killed a man! But when he accidentally cuts his finger, ink bleeds out, meaning he's still a comic book character, or something. Which the book treats as a surprise, but it's not. Because Skipper never even tried to return to his human self. Why would he not still be ink? Anyway, that's the end of the book, and I'm left with two questions. My first question is, what happened? Like, what exactly is going on with the Masked Mutant and the other comic book characters? Did they escape their comic book? Was there a portal in the building between the real world and the comic book world? Were they always like this, or did something happen to bring them into being? How are they affecting the print issues of the comic book? How are the comic book writers, artists, and publishers reacting to this? I wonder, not because I'm caught up in the logistics, not because I need a scientific explanation, but because knowing this stuff would help figure out the motivations of the plot. And I'm not saying make it complicated. You don't need to dump a bunch of lore and backstory and complex explanations into my lap. Like, okay, the Masked Mutant is the fictional main character of a villain-led comic book story. He's bored with his normal spandex-wearing foes, and through some Grant Morrison trademark magic, somehow becomes self-aware. Using his incredible intellect, he finds a way to escape the pages of the comic book into the real world in search for a real challenge. Like, that makes sense, right? It's simple. The science of it doesn't matter. What matters is that you have a clear narrative with an antagonist with clear goals. You can build your story from it. But why is the Galloping Gazelle and Magnificent Molecule Man there then? Did they come on their own? Did the Masked Mutant bring them there? What motivated their presence? It's making the narrative messy. Which brings me to the second question. What was the book trying to say? What was the main theme, the moral, the message at the core of it? It engages enough with real-world comic book practices that I think it's trying to be some kind of spoof or satire, but what it's trying to say eludes me. Let's consider Skipper's behavior. He's gone down the rabbit hole of collecting comic books for profit. He doesn't buy them to enjoy their stories and art. He never cracks them open. He immediately seals them up and puts them in a box where they'll never be appreciated. The book puts his behavior in direct contrast to both Wilson and Libby. Wilson collects stamps, something of no monetary value, but having and using these stamps gives him satisfaction. Libby also collects comics, but the Archie-style teen comedy comics, not the traditional superhero stuff flooding the market. She consumes a more specific niche that interests her, and she actually reads the comics, not setting them aside to collect dust. She appreciates them for their artistic value. But this doesn't go anywhere. Libby turns out to be the Masked Mutant, and we have that scene I read earlier about Wilson giving up his stamp collection. So both counterexamples to Skipper's behavior are invalidated. And there's nothing in the plot about comic collecting. Go Eat Worms was a trash book, but it had a fairly clear moral. Don't harm small creatures, and integrated it into the plot. Oh, you like to hurt worms? Well, here's a giant worm that's going to hurt you. So now you know what it's like. If the Masked Mutant was collecting people, sealing them into plastic bags and putting them away so that they could go up in value, well, that'd be corny as shit, but at least it would have a clarity of moral. So here's the part of the video where I try to make a better version of Attack the Mutant. In this version, Skipper collects comics, but he actually reads them. He's totally into Todd McFarlane and Rob Liefeld type stuff, all the violence and extreme attitude and scantily clad ladies and all that. Skipper's father tries to connect with his son, going, "Oh yeah, I collected comic books when I was your age. In fact, I still have a box of them in the garage. Let me go check." Father comes in with a box of old comic books from the 1950s, and Skipper looks at them and goes, "Gosh, these are so colorful and simple." Lame. Among his father's comics are a couple of issues of The League of Good Guys, a colorful superhero team that includes the Masked Mutant. He's a good guy here. Skipper recognizes the Masked Mutant because one of the comics he reads is a gritty 90s reimagining of Masked Mutant, now a big, gnarly, Lobo-like character, all chains and spikes and skull motifs. "My Masked Mutant is so much cooler than your Masked Mutant, Dad." Now, with this comparison, you are getting a bit into the kids these days territory, but comics in the early 90s sucked, so I don't really mind. One day, while on the bus to the dentist, Skipper sees what looks like the Masked Mutant's rad skull motorcycle outside a bar. He gets off the bus to look at it, and out of the bar walks the Masked Mutant himself, smoking a cigar. "You're the Masked Mutant! I'm your #1 fan!" The Masked Mutant is pleased with the praise and offers Skipper a ride on his motorcycle. As they ride, the Masked Mutant explains that he was bored with his comic book existence, that his writer was a total lame-o and was bowing down to the censors, so the mutant developed a magic amulet that let him escape the comic book pages. While they're riding, they come across a bank robbery. The mutant stops it, but uses more violence than was necessary and grabs a couple $100 for compensation. These behaviors that seem so cool in the comic pages are suddenly gross and unsettling in the real world. The Masked Mutant is being a bad influence on Skipper. He puts the kid in dangerous situations and peer pressures him into having a beer and punching people he doesn't like. Skipper gets in trouble, gets detention, gets grounded, and decides to cut ties with the mutant. But the mutant doesn't take no for an answer. "You're my sidekick now, Skipper. Wherever I go, you go. Oh, your parents? Parents are lame. Here, I'll take care of them." And then the Masked Mutant does something to contain the parents, like he shrinks them down and puts them into an empty fishbowl. Skipper is scared. He's lost control of his life, and this extreme comic book superhero isn't cool anymore. He's scary. So the Masked Mutant falls asleep in front of the TV, and Skipper does the only thing he can think to do. He steals the amulet that lets the mutant escape his comic book. The mutant wakes up and realizes that the amulet is gone, so he starts chasing Skipper around the house. In the rush of things, Skipper drops the amulet into a box of his father's comic books, and it glows and pulls out the 1950s version of the Masked Mutant into the real world. Unlike the 90s anti-hero mutant, the 50s mutant is extremely moral, all about peace, justice, and protecting the little guy. 90s mutant is self-centered, while the 50s mutant is self-sacrificing. On a power level, 90s mutant is so extreme that he could probably beat the 50s mutant in an extended fight, but his selfishness translates into cowardice, and when it becomes clear that 90s mutant can't intimidate 50s mutant, he backs down. 50s mutant uses the amulet to send the 90s mutant back into his comic, then restores Skipper's family. Before returning to his own comic book, the Masked Mutant monologues about the importance of bravery, of helping others, of brushing your teeth, and not being a bully. It's cheesy, but Skipper feels finally receptive to it. This old comic book from the 50s has inspired him to be a good person. Final page, we pull back and discover that this entire story was a comic book that some other kid was reading. "Lame," the kid says, and throws the Skipper comic into a box. Yeah, it's a first draft of an idea, but it answers my two questions. Question 1, what happened? It has a clear narrative. The 90s version of the Masked Mutant has clear motives for being in the real world. It doesn't matter that he got there from some hibbity-bibbity magic. We know why he's there, and we know what kind of threat he is to our protagonist, and the conclusion of bringing the 50s Masked Mutant into the real world is set up and drawn from rules that were previously established. Question 2. What is the book trying to say? It's a story about bullying and peer pressure, and how that stuff can make us do bad things, but it substitutes the real-world bullies with the trends of early 90s comic books, which makes it also a critique of those trends. Yes, that's a value judgment, but it's a value judgment I agree with, so... The one thing I do worry about this scenario is putting the 50s comic on too much of a pedestal. I think the moral contrast between the two eras of comic books is necessary, but trust me, comics in the 50s had their problems too. R.L. Stine's Attack of the Mutant certainly has a weird novelty to it, and that can carry you some of the way, but it feels rudderless. Skipper is an unlikable protagonist that never learns a lesson, the rules of this book are vague and inconsistent, and the conclusion is sudden and confusing and doesn't add up to much. R.L. Stine shows no evidence here of knowing what then modern comics were like, and therefore doesn't have anything to say about comics. Or anything to say at all, really. I give Attack of the Mutant some broken Spawn toys out of 10.